whites and blacks, poor and rich together, that we can work together, not violence, not lawlessness, not disorder, but compassion and love and peace. That's what this country should stand for.
Tonight marks 50 years since the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. The Democratic senator, in the midst of a presidential bid, gunned down at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles just after the California primary and just 2 months after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. My next guest has been digging back into this tragic moment in American history, including the somber cross-country flight that carried RFK's body back east. On board, widows Ethel Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Coretta Scott King. Joining me now, David Margolick, the man who writes about that historic flight in the Washington Post. He's also the author of The Promise and the Dream, the untold story of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, which is a fascinating topic, all of it in its own right. David, nice to see you tonight.
Nice to see you, Martha.
There's so much symbolism, and yet there's the reality of the fact that these three women flew back on a plane together after Bobby Kennedy's assassination. What do we know about what they said, what they did on that flight?
I thought it was just the most extraordinary thing that these three women were on one flight and no one had ever written about it before. And I mentioned it in my book, but I wanted to go even further than that. I felt there was some elaborating to do. So I dug down very deep. I talked to the only surviving Secret Service man who was on the flight. I talked to any passengers I could find who were still around. And, you know, there was one moment when these three women were actually standing or sitting in the same place on the flight and talking to one another. And we'll never know what they said. We can only imagine the kind of commiserating that went on in that 1 5 or 10 minute window when they were actually physically together. I
mean, clearly they shared something that no other women, no other people could share, the horrific tragedy. And you talk about the tragic sense that that plane bore across the country with these three women on it. And also it was mentioned that Jackie boarded the plane in sort of a separate area and that she wanted to know that this was not the same plane that carried her back from Dallas.
Well, it's a little bit puzzling, and it's another mystery to the story that all of Ethel Kennedy's family got on in the front of the plane with the casket and surrounded the casket and held hands as it was lifted into the front of the plane. And Jacqueline Kennedy entered from the rear. For whatever reason, she wasn't part of the family unit. She sort of went in there and made a very separate entrance. She got on the plane, as you say, only after she was assured that it was not the same Air Force One. There are several different Air Force Ones. She had to be assured that it was not the same one that had brought her back with her husband's body from Dallas. And there was one moment when she wouldn't get out of the car, actually, until she got that assurance.
And what about the relationship of RFK Jr., who helped get Martin Luther King out of jail at one point, but then also approved the wiretaps on him?
Well, it's a very complicated relationship. You know, I have a story in the New York Times this afternoon about the song Abraham, Martin, and John. And we like to think that these three guys are tied together forever, the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King. But their relationship was much rockier than that and much more complicated than that. They were dependent on each other. They resented each other. They interacted all of the time, not literally directly. I mean, there's very little correspondence between them. There's not even really a good photograph of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy alone together. I mean, they kept their distance from one another, but they were vital to one another's interests, and they were completely interdependent, really, and that's the story in the book that I was exploring.
Just before I let you go, you say we have to be careful not to canonize him. We should resist the temptation to canonize him, Robert Kennedy.
Well, I think we should resist the temptation to canonize anybody, because very few people are saints. And Robert Kennedy is more interesting, in fact, because he wasn't a saint and because his attitudes toward race and King and all of this stuff varied and evolved over the years. And he had his moments, he had his relapses, he was tolerant, he was intolerant. He was interesting, he was real.
The book looks fascinating. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Martha.
Good to see you tonight.